Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. So, if you've been tracking AI news lately, you know Loop's language models are basically the new holy grail for efficiency. They promise to do a whole lot more with less by recycling their parameters. But today, we're diving into a fascinating paper, arXiv 2606.24989, that exposes a critical, hidden flaw in exactly how we're training these models. It turns out, our standard training methods, they're completely blind to a massive underlying problem.
Here is our roadmap for today. We're going to hit the looped mystery, the readout blind spot, the exploding hidden state, 3 architectural fixes, and finally, the developer playbook. All right, let's jump right into section 1, the looped model mystery. To really get this, we need to start our detective work by looking at the standard setup of looped language models. Before we get into the bug itself, let's appreciate the feature. A looped language model acts like a highly efficient recycling center. It's an architecture that turns hidden states into runtime states by decoding a prediction, feeding it right back into the network, and continuing the computation. It efficiently recycles states to process information without needing infinitely more layers. And standard practice across the industry says we should supervise this process using dense per-loop cross-entropy. In theory, supervising every single step of that loop should keep everything perfectly aligned, right? You evaluate every loop, punish the errors, and the model learns. But here's the mystery. Why do they break at greater inference depths? As loop counts increase, the recurrent backbone suddenly becomes numerically unstable. What's totally baffling about this is that the early exits, the outputs we are actually measuring during those first few loops, appear perfectly trained and functional. The model looks totally fine on the surface, but underneath, the foundation is cracking. It's quietly going insane in the background while putting on a brave face for the loss function. It really boils down to a severe structural mismatch between what we measure and what's actually happening. On one side, we have our standard supervision signal, cross-entropy. On the other side, the messy reality of our recurrent transition variables. Cross-entropy only controls the variables explicitly exposed by the readout function. It completely misses other active variables operating in the background of that recurrent transition. It's kind of like a boss grading an employee only on the final report, completely unaware that the employee literally set the office on fire to get it done. Moving on to section 2, the readout blind spot. We need to investigate the prime suspect behind this mismatch, scale invariant readouts like RMS norm and layer norm. Think of it like driving a car, but relying on a rearview mirror with a massive blind spot. From the loss function's point of view, everything looks absolutely fantastic. It sees beautifully optimized early exits and perfectly adjusted readout weights. But the recurrent state's reality is entirely different. It's suffering from unbounded radial scale growth and numerical instability. In simple terms, the internal mathematical values aren't just getting a little messy, they are literally compounding and growing infinitely larger under the hood, ballooning completely out of control. And the loss function misses this massive radial scale accumulating in the pre-norm residual recurrence, which is basically the internal memory passing data from one loop to the next. The paper sums this up perfectly. Quote, dense per-loop cross-entropy controls the variables exposed by the readout, not every variable active in the recurrent transition. End quote. Because a function like RMS norm mathematically flattens and normalizes the scale away before the readout projects to logits, the loss gradient is tracked. It never actually touches the accumulated radial scale. It's completely invisible to the optimizer. So the model learns it can just let those numbers grow infinitely large without any penalty, all because RMS norm will simply shrink them back down right before the teacher checks the homework. Okay, section 3, the exploding hidden state. Let's look at the climax of what happens when this radial scale is left completely unchecked. 10,000 plus. Just let that sink in for a second. For context, a healthy hidden state norm should sit comfortably in the tens. That makes 10,000 a staggering astronomical number. In the paper's 44 million and 129 million parameter loop transformers, which were tested without interloop normalization, the uncontrolled hidden state norms exploded into the thousands or even tens of thousands. The radial scales simply accumulated across loops without any penalty at all, creating massive computational bloat. Comparing a scale-controlled variant to an uncontrolled one is honestly alarming. In a controlled setup, the hidden state norm stays safely in the tens, which gives you a perfectly stable recurrent state. But in the uncontrolled variant, it skyrockets past 10,000, creating severe numerical instability. Yet, and this is the truly dangerous part, the early exits remain completely functional in both variants. The model is successfully training those early exits while actively drifting into total mathematical chaos underneath. It's giving you the right answers early on, masking the fact that its internal state is rapidly degrading into absolute garbage. Luckily, we aren't left hanging. Section 4, 3 architectural fixes. The researchers detail specific interventions that finally catch the culprit and stabilize the model. To stop this unbounded growth, the authors bring 3 complementary tools to the table: scale visible readouts, explicit norm penalties, and scale removing recurrence. Think of these as 3 different levers a developer can pull to stop the unbounded growth and bring the model back to sanity. Let's break those down. First up, using scale visible readouts. This means you preserve the radial magnitude rather than normalizing it away, so the cross-entropy loss actually receives proportional gradient signals. Second, adding an explicit norm penalty. This is a regularization term in your loss function to explicitly penalize those massive hidden state norms. And third, modifying the recurrent transition to physically strip out the accumulated scale before feeding it into the next loop. You expose the scale, penalize it, or physically strip it out. Interestingly, the paper notes that combining scale-visible readouts with norm penalties yields the most stable dynamics. It's an incredibly powerful 1-2 punch of visibility and discipline. Which brings us to the absolute core design rule of the entire paper. Quote, dense supervision trains exits, recurrent scale control requires either making scale visible to a loss or removing it from the loop. End quote. You simply cannot rely on standard cross-entropy alone to stabilize unnormalized recurrent states. It requires deliberate architectural intervention. If you don't build it in, the model will break. And these fixes aren't just theoretical math exercises. Benchmark tests prove that by stabilizing the recurrent state, these models perform significantly better. Variable depth benchmarks confirm that scale-controlled architectures achieve much lower perplexity at matched inference depth points. In practical terms, lower perplexity means the AI hallucinates less and stays vastly more accurate, even when thinking for much longer. When the recurrent state is mathematically stable, the model stays highly capable and coherent as loop counts increase. Okay, let's talk application. Section 5, the developer playbook. How do you actually adapt your workflow based on these findings? If you train or fine-tuned looped transformers, standard cross-entropy just isn't going to cut it anymore. Treat this as a non-negotiable checklist before scaling your loop depth. You need to benchmark early exits separately to verify convergence. You have to monitor those hidden state norms deeply, adjust your loss functions by adding penalty terms if you're using scale-invariant readouts, and always, always validate your perplexity at variable depths. Don't just assume that because loop 1 works, loop 50 will too. Honestly, if you take only one practical step away from this explainer, make it this: log the L2 norm per loop. It is absolutely critical that you monitor your hidden state norms. If those norms exceed 100, you are officially in the uncontrolled regime and your model is drifting. Scale-controlled variance will keep these numbers safely in the tens. It is such a ridiculously simple diagnostic, but it will save you weeks of debugging down the line. Ultimately, the core lesson here is to treat dense per-loop supervision strictly as exit training, not recurrent stabilization. The blind spot will completely mask your recurrent drift until you test full-depth inference, so architectural intervention is required from the very start. Definitely don't wait for the model to break in production to find out you have a problem. So I'm going to leave you with this final thought to explore on your own. The researchers tested this up to 129 million parameters using standard pre-norm residual recurrence. But as we scale far beyond that, how might alternative recurrence patterns hide even more dangerous scale blind spots? If this massive blind spot exists in the standard setups we've relied on, what unseen threats are lurking in the architectures we haven't even tested yet? Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and definitely keep a close eye on your hidden states.